Welcome to, I guess, week two of running repairs. So this week we're going to be talking about proximal hamstring tendinopathy, which is funny because it's actually one of the videos that really kind of like started a community on YouTube on my channel. So, obviously it makes sense that we're going to talk about it. And there's a whole lot that goes into this. One, it's definitely one of those conditions that takes a long time. It's not one that seems to respond really quickly. So, uh, you know, obviously with proximal hamstring tendinopathy, there tends to be a lot of frustration because it's slow to respond. And so, yeah, let's get into it. So, proximal hamstring tendinopathy, also called like upper hamstring tendinopathy, is basically if we look at the anatomy here. So we'll bring out our little model here, and so we're looking at the pelvis, and on the bottom here is the ischial and so that's the bottom side of the pelvis. This is the leg here. And what ends up happening is that the hamstring actually attaches onto this bone. And so we can have pain right in that junction, right where the insertion is. And typically, these conditions are worse with any sort of like hip flexion. So you can think about sitting. That's typically a big one. People will have a lot of pain when they're just sitting down in chairs, especially something that's hard. Um, we can have pain with running. We can have pain going up and down stairs, pain with squats, anything that just requires the hip to be flexed. And the reason why that occurs is that one, all tendon issues are an overload issue, just meaning that the loads placed on the tendon are more than what they can tolerate. But because of the way the anatomy is with proximal hamstring tendinopathy here, is that when you flex the hip, so when the hip goes like this, what ends up happening is that there's more compression against the bone. And so it's not only it's not only tensile loads, which are loads you normally think of where the tendon gets stretched this way, but there's also compressive loads up against that ischial tuberosity. And so the combination of those tensile loads plus compressive loads leads to the overload with proximal hamstring tendinopathy and then pain. Um, and so uh, when we look at some of the research with those compressive loads, and the reason why this is important is that those experiencing proximal hamstring tendinopathy, they get pain when they stretch the hamstring. So that typical one leg up, kind of like just stretching your hamstrings or doing a forward fold in yoga, those will tend to be provocative positions. And so there was originally research, and I believe it was in rats. And what they found was that tensile loads plus compressive loading that would be sufficient load to cause a tendinopathy or tendon pain. And the thing with that research and the way that it gets misinterpreted is that people just see compressive loads and so they just think stretching. But in that research, the compressive loads alone or stretching wasn't sufficient to cause changes in the tendon. And the reason why that's important is because that has been misinterpreted because people will see that compressive loads and stretch is provocative in those with proximal hamstring tendinopathy. And so they build a fear avoidance behavior. So they won't want to stretch, um, they won't want to flex the hip or do anything in that way because it's provocative. One, it's going to cause pain, but then also they don't want to damage their tendons. And the problem with that is that if we look at rehab in general, you have to be able to build up tolerance to those positions. And so if you're only avoiding um, flexing the hip, then it's never going to build up tolerance. And then every time that you're sitting down, you're squatting, you're running, anything that includes hip flexion is probably going to be painful because it just can't tolerate those loads. And so initially during rehab, it makes sense that we'd kind of say, like, you know what, um, it's causing too much pain and irritation. We might want to limit the amount of hip flexion, but we need to have a plan eventually to reintroduce hip flexion and those compressive loads. Otherwise, that tolerance is never just going to be built. So Initially, with the rehab program, yeah, we might opt for loading the hamstrings with the hamstring or the hip more in a neutral position, and then gradually build up into hip flexion. And so, if you've watched any of the YouTube videos that I've made on that, that's basically the progression of we start with loading the hamstring in a more neutral position and then gradually introduce hip flexion, typically with what's called isometric exercises, which are just exercises where we contract the muscle, but we actually don't move the joint. And so the most common example of an isometric exercise is a wall sit. And so if you think about a wall sit, you're not actually really moving, right? You're just sitting against the wall and your hamstrings are contracting. And so that's an example of an isometric contraction. And so when we look at for the hamstring, we'd want to do some sort of like hip extension or knee flexion. And so hip extension, I guess I could stand, but it's fine. So hip extension is where the leg goes that way. So this is the front, this is the back. And so hip extension is just that way. And then if we look at knee flexion, with our little anatomy model here, we'll go that way. So knee flexion is this way. And so when we look at the rehab program, oh no, we're stuck on our shirt again. When we look at the rehab program, we can either do an isometric focus more on the knee or on the hip. And that's just because the hamstring cross both the knee and the hip. So we can just pick and choose which one we want to load, just depending on tolerance. Obviously, if we're looking at more of a proximal hamstring, then we probably want to load more at the hip. But if we load at the knee, we're still getting muscle contraction and load at the proximal hamstring portion. So it just depends on tolerance and which one we're able to tolerate better. What up, everyone? Thanks for joining. Talking about proximal hamstring tendinopathy here. And so that's basically why, or basically how we would structure a rehab program, is we would start off with loading the hip in a neutral position and then gradually build up, mostly through isometrics initially. However, then we'd go through what's called concentric and eccentric, or isotonic loading. There's just a bunch of fancy names for how the muscle actually contracts. And so a concentric contraction is where when the muscle contracts, the angle shortens. And so if we look at the biceps here, a concentric contraction would be this way, where the muscle is contracting as the joint is moving this way. Basically, the muscle is getting shorter in that contraction. And then an eccentric muscle contraction is where the muscle is actually lengthening as it's contracting. So for the biceps, again, we'd be going this way. And so the muscle is contracting, but it's actually lengthening. And so for most tendon issues, the emphasis is typically on eccentric muscle contractions. It places a little bit more load on the tendons, although when we're doing it to make rehab simple, we actually don't have to separate just eccentric contractions versus concentric contractions. You can actually just load through the entire range of motion and you'll get benefit out of it. If anything, you'll actually probably get more benefit, just because when you think about how you're going to use your muscles and your ligaments and your joints, you're going to be going through the full range of motion. So you might as well strengthen both portions of it. The big thing when you're looking at rehab for tendons is that you want to perform them slowly. And so this is probably one of the biggest errors that people make in their rehab for tendons, is that they perform the contractions too quickly. And, I think we all get it. Nobody wants to spend a whole lot of time in their rehab and just make it last longer and longer, right? But if we're looking at how tendons adapt, we actually need to load them slowly. And so typically when we're looking at loading programs for tendons, we want to load them over 6 to 8 seconds. So when we're talking about the concentric and eccentric muscle contractions, we want each one of those phases to be over 3 to 4 seconds. So if we're looking at the biceps here, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, which just means that each rep is going to be a long period of time. And that's just necessary for the tendon to actually sense the load and to be able to adapt to it. We can't use the same rehab principles that we would for let's say muscles, where muscles are very responsive to load. So we might be able to get away with loading a muscle strain um, in a different way, typically like a faster load, um, because they're going to adapt to almost anything that you or any way that you load them. Where tendons, we need to load them slowly. So that's probably the biggest error that most people do in their rehab programs is that they perform each contraction too quickly. And so, of course, like as you go through a rehab program, you're kind of like, my tendon's just not responding to this load. And well, it's not necessarily the exercise that's not right. It's the way that you're doing them. So when it comes to rehabs, especially for proximal hamstring tendinopathy, perform each rep slowly. I know it sucks, but when we're doing concentric and eccentric loading, perform them over 6 to 8 seconds. That'll make sure that you're actually loading the tendon and you'll get the tendon to adapt. The second part there is that when we look at a rehab program, we need to make sure that we're loading it over a long period of time. If you're experiencing any sort of tendon issue, especially proximal hamstring tendinopathy, the tendon is slow to respond. And so if you've only been doing your rehab program for 1, 2, 3 weeks, it's typically just not enough time for the tendon to be able to adapt. And so most rehab programs are going to be over 12 weeks, which is 3 months. And so um, when you're structuring a rehab program, we want to make sure that one, we're loading sufficiently. So we're loading over 6 to 8 seconds for each rep. But we also want to make sure that we're doing them over a long enough period of time so the tendon actually adapts. So that means loading at least 12 weeks. And typically, 2 to 3 times per week is usually sufficient in that. And it just depends on what the response to load is. That's probably one of the biggest questions that I get on all of the videos is how often and how frequently should I be loading? I guess that's kind of the same thing. But basically, how frequently should I be loading? And the response that I always give is it depends on your response. And what I typically mean by that is that if you load one day and the next day it's really sore, you don't feel like you can do another like rehab session, then you probably loaded one a little bit too heavy. And so it doesn't make sense to try to load again the next day because your tendon is still responding. Tendons typically for plyometric exercises, which is like a jumping thing, that typically takes 72 hours, so 3 days. But you would want to make sure that you have enough recovery in between each session. And so the frequency depends on what your tolerance is. If you load it once and it like feels good the next day, then yeah, you could probably load it again, or you can increase your load. But typically, you want 2 to 3 sessions per week. That's typically what's needed to be able to adapt. If you're doing less than that, like if you're only loading once per week, the tendon's probably not going to change that much. Um, let's see here. Welcome back, Joshua. How do you know when to progress? Uh, is it if the pain isn't increasing the next day? Also, what are the signs you rehab? Yeah, great questions. So, uh, to be honest, knowing when to progress is a little bit of an art, more so than a science, unfortunately. What I typically look for when I'm looking to progress is one is actually confidence. So I'll typically ask people like, how do you feel with the exercises? Do you feel confident that you can load more? Do you feel like you can handle more? Because if someone doesn't feel like they have a lot of confidence in, their proximal hamstring tendon or ACL or ankle or whatever, then it can be challenging to make sure that they're ready to progress if they just don't feel confident in whatever exercise they're currently doing or what the progression is. And so I think confidence is a big criteria of looking at when to progress. But yeah, I think your point is when we're looking at like tolerance, okay, if we loaded on Sunday, let's say, how did we feel Monday, right? Was it sore? Like, are we able to still walk around and move around? Like, is the pain increased? Is the pain like what our baseline is? If the pain doesn't increase the next day and we're feeling like we can move around and all that kind of stuff, it typically means that it tolerated that load. And so typically, I want a couple of like days that we feel like that because, sometimes you have a good day and you rehab it, it feels great, and the next day it flares up and it gets really pissed off. And so I typically look for a couple of days where the pain is manageable the next day. There's not a increase in pain, and they feel confident in that they can increase their load a little bit or change the difficulty of it, then that's typically what I look for when looking to progress the exercises. It also depends on what stage of the rehab program they're in. If we're looking at proximal hamstring tendinopathy specifically, a lot of people tend to get stuck in the isometric phase, which is fine as a starting exercise, but we typically need to start adding some load. And the reason for that is typically we're trying to add in some hip flexion to build up that tolerance for some of those activities. And if we're only doing isometrics, it's probably not going to get to that point. And so we want to do isometrics to build up a little bit of tolerance to load. But I'm probably going to be aggressive is probably not the right word, but I'm probably going to be more likely to progress that exercise to something more challenging versus if they're already doing concentric and eccentric contractions, then I might not be in a rush to actually like progress the weight of the exercise. So that's where like the art side of it comes into play versus more of the science aspect. Um, and then third question, I think I answered part of this. But what are the signs your rehab exercises are stressing things out too much? It's the response to load, typically 24 hours. So typically we look at three different criteria when assessing load. And the first one is pain level during the exercise. With tendon issues, we're typically okay with some pain during loading, but we don't want it to be too much, obviously. Typically, 5 out of 10 is the general recommendation, but pain scale is very subjective. So typically, it's just what do you feel comfortable loading with? Some people, they don't feel comfortable loading with much pain. Some people feel too comfortable loading through pain. And so we just want to make sure that it's something that's tolerable. The second criteria is pain can't interfere with sleep. And so if you're loading too much and let's say you're dealing with proximal hamstring tendinopathy or gluteal tendinopathy or Achilles, whatever, I mean, any sort of pain syndrome, I think we could use the same criteria, is that if it's interfering with sleep, it means that the load was too much. Because we know that sleep is very important, one, for chronic pain, but also for recovery as well. And so if you load too heavy and don't sleep very well, chances are um, you're not going to recover appropriately. Um, and then the third, let me think what the third criteria was. Third criteria is pain the next day. And so we don't want an increase in pain the next day because again, that probably means that we loaded too much the day before. So the three criteria is pain that's tolerable, typically less than 5 out of 10, no pain interfering with sleep, and then no increases in pain 24 hours afterwards. That's typically the criteria overall. I am not a bodybuilder. Um, no, 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 no. I I don't know. I was gonna say I wish, but uh, I don't know. I like weightlifting. I like strength training, but uh, not really into bodybuilding so much. Um, but you know, I guess like even if we look back at like proximal hamstring tendinopathy, it's pretty common. Pretty common is probably not the right way to phrase that. It's pretty common in the strength training community. And it's just because loading at the end range. Typically, when we look at squats or deadlifts, um, high tensile loads, which just means loads going through the tendon like that, plus compressive loads. And so it's pretty common in that no, 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 not physique either. I used to actually work with a lot of bodybuilders and physique, and great community. But there, and like going back to the question before, um, knowing when to push through pain or when pain is acceptable with rehab exercises. Um, that community, like because they're typically training for a show, they will push through whatever it is. It doesn't matter if their shoulder is really painful, if they're dealing with knee pain, if they're dealing with hip pain or something like that. They're going to push through, and so uh, by the time that their show is afterwards, like their recovery is tough because they've been dealing with some sort of injury that's happened for a very long time. And then the problem is that they typically have another show coming up in a couple of months. Um, and yeah, so I'm a chiropractor, so I deal with a lot of injuries, mostly rehabbing injuries. Um, I did a little bit of performance based work as well, or like preventative type of stuff. So um, yeah, yeah, it's funny because like I myself have not like I do some strength training myself, but uh, that community found me. um, say someone is very irritable, maybe 7 out of 10 with daily activities in that situation in terms of pain and rehab. Base it off of pain. Yeah, I think I think when you're looking at like any sort of pain syndrome, the tough thing is like when it's a high, like when the base level of pain is high, 7, 8, 9, 10 out of 10 pain, right? Um, it could be hard to rehab, right? Just because the sensitivity is so high that it doesn't matter what you do, like the pain level is already high, and if it increases to from a 7 out of 10 to an 8 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10, well, like that, I don't know, like the pain scale is probably not linear. Is a super nerdy way to phrase that. In that, like the difference from like a 1 or 2 out of 10 and a 7 or 8 out of 10, there's a big difference in terms of like what the impact is. And so, if the pain is very iterable or it fluctuates a lot, so it goes from a 1 to an 8, down to a 3, back up to a 9. With those kind of cases, typically we're going to try to stabilize our rehab. So we might do some lighter weights, some smaller movements. Typically, isometrics are where this fits into a rehab program. Is because if we could still load, fantastic, because that will kind of help longer term. But we also don't want to cause any flare ups or anything like that. So we want to just find that balance of okay, can we get that pain level to be reduced where it's not impacting daily activities, right? But can we still kind of push the rehab program forward, all like, but maybe it's slowly. It's so that's typically how I would approach something like that, and I think most people would approach it. Is that if the pain level's too high at baseline, like, yeah, we're probably not gonna push too many rehab exercises. You know, proximal hamstring tendinopathy specifically, since obviously, like, that's, the theme of this, live, like, typically the pain is painful with certain activities, but, like, typically baseline pain overall isn't too high, sitting being the exception there, because if you're sitting most of the day, then that's going to be aggravating. But like I think of like my example would be like low back pain, right? If someone's coming in with 10 out of 10 low back pain, they can't bend down to put on their shoes. They're having a hard time getting out of bed and stuff like that. Probably not going to be doing a bunch of rehab exercises, right? Like we're not going to go through the big McGill Big Three. We're not going to be going and doing planks and side planks and bird dogs and all that kind of stuff. The pain level's too high just overall, and so we just need to get things to calm down. Like, and so in that case, like, can we get that person to go for a walk to get things to calm down? Like, maybe we do, I don't know, some light core bracing type things. Um, you know, so that's kind of what you're looking at, or like how you would approach like that high level of pain in structuring a rehab program. I'm in the Bay Area, is where I'm located. What's up, Archer? Thanks for joining. Um, yeah, and so let me see here. Uh, yeah, thanks for the questions. Thanks for joining, everyone. I see there's a couple of you guys in here. It's awesome. Um, not SF. Um, no, no. I'm in the Bay Area, um, but yeah. Trying to think of where I was on on talking specifically about proximal hamstring tendinopathy. But because I think we went through, let's see here, we went through isometric exercises, we went through concentric eccentric exercises. Plyometric exercises can be helpful, especially when looking at Greenland. Awesome, welcome. Um, Plyometric exercises, obviously, like when you're looking at like return to sport and specifically like return to running, with any tendon issue, but obviously with proximal hamstring tendinopathy, you want to gradually increase the load, and the rehab should gradually look more and more like whatever you're trying to return to. And so when it comes to plyometric exercises, that's where you're going to be doing a lot of hopping, a lot of single leg jumps, that kind of stuff, just preparing the tendon for those quicker loads. If you think about what we were talking about with the concentric and eccentric contractions, they're slow, right? Because we're trying to get the tendon to adapt and we're trying to get the tendon to be able to tolerate more load. So each contraction is going to be over 6 to 8 seconds. But if you look at running or jumping or something like that, like the load on the tendon, very quick, right? Because with each step, I always like running with my fingers. I don't know. I think it looks funny. But with each step, the time in contact with the ground isn't very much, which means that the tendon has a spike in load very quickly once you hit the ground with each step. And so you want to make sure that one, the tendon is strong enough and it has the capacity to tolerate the loads, but we also need to make sure that it's able to tolerate the loads when the load is a spike, right? Which is where plyometric exercises come into play. Now, if you're not planning to return back to running, sprinting, jumping, any of those kind of things, plyometric exercises might actually not be that important in the rehab program. You can typically stop at concentric eccentric once you're able to do whatever you need to do. But if we're looking at returning specifically to um, some sort of sport, probably going to have to do plyometric exercises to be able to get back safely. And then whenever we're looking at tendons, tendons take longer to respond, or sorry, to recover from plyometric exercises. And so typically they need about 72 hours to recover. And so when we're looking at plyometric exercises with tendon rehab, we want to make sure that we're not overloading it, especially in the beginning when you're starting to reintroduce plyometric exercises. So once every 3 days is typically what's recommended um, to make sure that it's that you're doing it safely. Let me see here. Seems like as long as you don't aggravate a tissue in the body, the body will adapt to the load you place on it. So gradually load till you build. Yeah, yeah. So the principle that this is called the SAID principle. So it's specific adaptations to impose demands. Um, and like if you think about the body's really good about adapting to whatever thing, right? If we're looking at the musculoskeletal system, right? If you go to the gym and you lift weights, your biceps, your glutes, your hamstrings, your quads, all those muscles will respond to the loads that you're placing on them. Obviously, it needs consistent load for it to adapt, because if you just do it once, like the body senses the stimulus, but it's not going to change much, because if you think about muscle, it takes a lot of resources to maintain muscle. And so you need that consistent stimulus to be able to, for the body to say, like, oh, we should actually build muscles to it instead of like, oh, that was a weird one time occurrence where we had to lift something heavy. Um, And so the body will adapt to most loads that you place on it. The question is like, um, what's the upper edge of what it can adapt to, right? We see that with running and trying to get under a 2 hour marathon, right? Like you can push the body to adapt and try to get all the tendons to be as efficient as possible, try to increase the force production to run as fast as you can for as long as you can. But there's going to be a certain point where adaptation is going to be very hard to improve on. Obviously, that's an extreme example, but when we look at the Olympics, it's the same thing. They're constantly getting their body to adapt to whatever they want to do, but it could be tough to like what's the end point there. And part of that has to do with genetics. You look at like the attachment of like different muscles or how big a muscle is versus how big a tendon is, and there's certain benefits to certain ways that the muscle or tendon is constructed, which will be either advantageous or disadvantageous. Let me get through a couple more of these questions here. Pain inhibits muscle, like if you hit your arm on something. Yeah, yeah. So the way to think about pain, I think a lot of times people think about, I think the way that a lot of people think about pain is that pain is an indication of damage, and it can be, but that doesn't necessarily mean yes, right? To your example, like if you hit your elbow on something, it doesn't mean that you broke your elbow or something like that. I mean, you could if you hit it hard enough, but like typically, if you hit your elbow on something, you get a little bit of pain, but then it decreases relatively quickly. And the reason that occurs, or the reason why you have pain in that situation, is more of a protective mechanism to say that you hit your elbow on something, look at the elbow, is it okay? Right? And so if you think about pain as a protector and not necessarily as an indication of damage, then if you have like a muscle strain or tendon pain or something like that, it makes sense, right? Because the pain is trying to protect you from overloading that tissue to make sure that you can recover. And that's the interesting part about rehab. And typically, when you look at tendons, is that when we rehab tendons, we're okay with pain during the exercise. And it's because we want the tendon to adapt. But if we let pain be our guide there, anytime that you would have pain with loading the tendon, you would probably stop or reduce the load, which would also reduce the amount of adaptation the tendon would have. So if you think about pain as the protector, and then you check to make sure, like, one, is this actually detrimental to whatever we're doing? Is there potential like damage or injury or something that would make it so that this is inappropriate? If you can say like, and this is where like an evaluation by a healthcare provider is important because they can look at it and go, okay, if we're getting pain with loading the hamstring, it's okay. Like we know that it's not a full tear. We know that it's not a different cause. We need to get the tendon or hamstring or whatever to adapt. We need to load it. And so hopefully that helps um, explain kind of like pain in a nutshell. Maybe I'll do one of these on chronic pain. I think that would be a really good topic. Leave a comment. I don't know if you can leave. I guess you can leave comments on here. Leave a comment if you'd want to see that in the future. Why does hamstring tendinopathy occur due to sitting for long periods of time? Would exercises help to get rid of the pain for good? Yeah. So when we look at proximal hamstring tendinopathy, what ends up happening, I actually don't have a band. I should have grabbed a band. But when we look at proximal hamstring tendinopathy, so ischotuberosity is here. So it's the bottom part of the pelvis. And then we have the leg here. And so the hamstring attaches here and then goes down the leg. And so that's what causes it to move. And so when you're sitting, your hip is flexed here, which causes compression of the tendon here. And so what ends up happening is that just over a long period of time, that compressive load against the ischial tuberosity leads to pain in the tendon. And so if you think about like one, I guess if you're here for my super long rant about any tissue adapting, is that if you don't load into hip flexion, the tendon won't adapt to those compressive loads. And so initially, yeah, we might need to limit the amount of compressive loads on the tendon just for comfort's sake, so you can sit throughout the day and all that kind of stuff. But when we look at the rehab program, we want to gradually increase the loads that we're doing in um, with the hip flexed, so that way you can build up tolerance to those compressive loads. And so, one, like if you're thinking about like sitting for long periods of time, right? Like you might be able to tolerate 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, right? And it might depend on the chair that you're in. And so you're able to tolerate some amount of compressive loads and some amount of hip flexion. You just need to figure out how to build tolerance to whatever it is, whether it's a harder surface or a longer period of time. I actually made a video on this, and basically, there's a couple of different ways that you can do it. One, you can go through some, it's called graded exposure, right? Where we're just loading the hip into flexion, typically not with much load. So you can think about that as mostly stretches, actually. So you could be in a quadruped position and kind of like rock your hips back just to kind of get that hip into flexion. You could do a forward fold. You could do a hamstring stretch, and just tweak how much you're actually flexing the hip. And then you can load it. So you can progress all the way into a deadlift or into a squat where you're loading that hamstring more into hip flexion. So increasing those compressive loads in between that ischial tuberosity and the hamstring. And that should help gradually build up some tolerance there um, to sitting for longer periods of time. A wall sit would be another great example where the hip is flexed a little bit, but you're still having some load on it. Um, yeah. Uh, yeah, 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 and I think that's a great point, Joshua. Sorry, um, is that a lot of times with proximal hamstring tendinopathy, there's a fear of sitting because it compresses the tendon against the ischial tuberosity. But when we look at that original research, so that research of course, of course. When we look at that original research, so it was performed in rats, first of all. But basically, what that research looked at was compressive loading and tensile loading. And so, tensile loading, let me grab this. So, tensile loading, um, if this is the tendon, tensile loading is if we're pulling this way. So the load is actually going that way. Compressive loading would be this way against the tendon. Hopefully that makes sense in the difference in compressive loads versus tensile loads. And so compressive loads are typically higher with sitting, right? Um, and the tensile loads, though, with sitting are very low because you're just not loading the tendon that much this way. Um, and so that original research found that uh, for there to be actual changes to the tendon, it had to be high tensile loads with high compressive loads, right? And so if we think about sitting, low tensile loads, higher compressive loads, not enough load in the tendon to actually cause a structural change. Um, Obviously, like when we look at deadlifting would be higher tensile loads plus higher compressive loads. And so if the tendon isn't ready for those loads, yeah, doing a max deadlift probably not the best idea. But you would also typically have to do that over a longer period of time um, for the tendon to have a structural change. It's not typically going to be one max deadlift that's going to cause changes to the tendon. And so that's why. So I guess to go back, that's why sitting isn't actually harmful or dangerous for the tendon. Is that the tensile loads are low, the compressive loads are higher, but overall the load on the tendon is fairly low, and so it's not going to cause any structural damage like a tear or anything like that. It's just being in a flex position and having those compressive loads, especially on a harder surface, that will cause pain in those with proximal hamstring tendinopathy. But I think that's also part of the conversation that I've had a lot of times about proximal hamstring tendinopathy is that there's a lot of fear around sitting and compressive loads. And so people don't ever load into hip flexion, especially in their rehab programs. And so they never build up tolerance. So they typically will always exceed their threshold of what they can tolerate when sitting because they never built up any tolerance to compressive loads with sitting. And so not that you have to ignore all pain and just sit all day and stretch and do all that kind of stuff, but there needs to be a plan, or there should be a plan, to gradually build up that tolerance. Otherwise, like, yeah, it makes sense that every time that you do the same thing, it's going to produce the same outcome. Hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if that actually made sense there. Um, uh, Generally speaking, high tensile, low type of squats typically doesn't cause pain, but sitting. Yeah, yeah, and I mean, it's when we look at tendons typically are responsive to load, in that, typically, like, loading them is what the criteria is for, diagnosing, a condition, right? But that's not always the case. Like to your point here, um, like deadlifts and squats, like yeah, they're higher tensile loads plus higher compressive loads, but maybe because they're performed slowly, they're better tolerated. Um, Sitting, like, especially like harder surfaces, um, it can just be provocative, and I think sometimes like it's time dependent. Obviously, like I think that there's some people who are experiencing like a lot of sensitivity to compressive loads, and so it doesn't matter. Like like for some, even thinking about sitting on a hard surface can generate some pain. But there's some people who can't sit more than 30 minutes, can't sit more than an hour without the pain, and it's because that sensitivity is so high that as soon as they're in a compressive load or they have compressive load on the tendon, it generates the pain. Which is why, like with chronic pain cases like that, that's where we do things like graded exposure, which just means that we gradually expose them to the movement and the load, um, to help build up that tolerance and to decrease that fear. Um, and so, yeah, yeah, I think there's when we look at tendons, it's not as simple as high tensile load, high compressive loads, pain, right? Because I think like not as much in proximal hamstring tendinopathy, but a little bit more in gluteal tendinopathy, which is just on the side of the hip there. Um, it interferes with sleep because a lot of people are side sleepers. They compress the tendon and it causes pain. So if it's the downside, it compresses the pain or it compresses the tendon. If it's the top leg and they have that leg kind of like over top, if you guys know what I'm talking about, um, that long stretch can also produce pain. And so if you can't sleep through the night or your sleep is consistently not piriformis syndrome, which is we can get into that later. Uh, it's just one of the glute tendons on the side, and so the glutes over to the side here, they come off of the iliac crest here, and they attach here. So we're looking at the side view. The pain is typically right here where the tendon is, where the piriformis muscle is back here. Um, and so where was I? If you don't, if you're not sleeping well, then your increased sensitivity or your sensitivity to various things will increase. My example typically is like nights where you don't sleep well, and then the next day you're probably a little bit more irritable, right? Somebody, I don't know, you go get coffee and they mess up your order, or it's taking longer. Like you might just be more frustrated, right? You're just kind of like, why is this taking so long? Like, I don't understand. There's not that many people here. Your sensitivity to things has increased um, because you didn't sleep well. And when we look at pain syndromes, that also is true. And so, uh, with gluteal tendinopathy, but we'll get back to proximal hamstring tendinopathy. If you're not sleeping well, your sensitivity to various things reduces. And so all of a sudden, like maybe sitting, for example, maybe one day you were able to sit for 4 hours. You're like, wow, things are going great. But then you didn't sleep well. And then the next day, you can't sit for more than 30 minutes, right? And you're like, oh, like I regressed. Like things got worse. Like something, maybe the exercises flared things up. Could be. But you're like, I don't understand. Like what happened? Well, if you just didn't sleep well, you probably have less tolerance to various things, including your compressive loads, and that's why things are a little bit irritated. And that's also like when I'm answering questions on all the videos, and they're like, "How often should I do things?" It depends, right? I always tell everybody like, if things are very irritable, it's okay to take a day off, right? Like, we don't want you to take 4 weeks off necessarily, but if things are super irritating, you're like, hey, work was super stressful. I didn't sleep well. Like, I don't know, my nutrition is terrible and I didn't drink any water. Maybe that's not the day to either progress the exercises, like we were talking about before, or to even maybe do them. Like maybe we skip that day and then we go the next day where, you slept better, work wasn't as stressful, hydration and diet and all that kind of stuff is better that day. Cool. And then I think we were talking about this a long time ago too. You also maybe might feel more confident in exercising that day versus the day that's super stressful. And so there's a lot of kind of like variables here when we're looking at exercises and rehab and all that kind of stuff. It's not as simple as just going 3 days a week, 12 weeks, 6 to 8 second contractions, like load heavy, everything will be perfect. I mean, like maybe in a lab setting that where you can control all the variables, but that's not real world. So um, we have to take all those things into consideration because again, we're also looking at long term, right? Like if we load one day where our tolerance is low, but it causes a flare up, like either we're not going to do the exercise again because we're like, hey, those exercises not for me, um, or we had to take some time off because we flared things up too much, and so it's better just to skip that day in that one instance. Um, glad to hear the analogy was helpful. I love using analogies to help explain things, and sometimes I like the analogies get a little bit crazy. And but glad that one helped. But yeah, what else you guys got for questions there? Um, I'm trying to think of because I think I pretty much covered everything. I know we've been talking about kind of like some of the rehab and all that kind of stuff for a while. Um, but yeah, um, yeah, yeah. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. This is week week two of doing these lives and kind of like explaining topics. First one was more of just like a trial. We didn't have a theme or anything like that. Obviously, this one we're talking about proximal hamstring tendinopathy. But I think a lot of the principles that we're talking about with this relate to most tendinopathies as well. Like if we're talking about gluteal tendinopathy, Achilles tendinopathy, patellar tendinopathy, I think a lot of these principles still apply. Obviously, the exercises are a little bit different for each one of those. But even tendinopathy, excluding tendinopathy, I think a lot of these principles also apply to just most rehab um, injury type stuff too. Like, if you're dealing with low back pain, sleep can be impacted, and then that's a really tough one because you need sleep to recover. And if you're not sleeping well, then the pain typically kind of like spirals a little bit, and so you have to kind of like figure out like how do we get good quality sleep so we can actually recover. Uh, it's actually one of the toughest things about rotator cuff injuries because they're typically worse at night, which means that you roll over on that shoulder, it's painful, you wake up, you roll over to the other shoulder, you go back to sleep, you end up rolling back onto that shoulder again, more pain. And so sleep is impacted, which, we talked about it a lot. Sleep is really impactful for recovery. Just that's when a bunch of chemicals go into repair the tissues. But in terms of pain sensitivity as well, it's very important. And so um, conditions that typically interfere with sleep, they're tough. But yeah, yeah. How I guess what'd you guys think? I actually really liked doing a little bit more of a tailored video here, specifically on proximal hamstring. I can't talk. Specifically on proximal hamstring tendinopathy, um, and so I thought I think it's helpful, and it helps me just stay focused a little bit. Um, and so, yeah, I think next time we might do another tendinopathy. We'll probably do maybe patellar or Achilles. We'll see. Feel free to leave a comment on one of the videos if there's something you guys want to see in particular. I know it seems like maybe a chronic pain one would be really helpful as well. I think especially like with some of these things when we're looking at like proximal hamstring tendinopathy, uh, gluteal tendinopathy, low back pain, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of it could be challenging to kind of like know what to do and understand why the pain is being so persistent. Um, and so we'll probably do a chronic pain one here at some point as well. I think that would be helpful. But I think we'll run through some of the tendon things first here, and obviously, like just like we did today, we'll sprinkle in some chronic pain or some pain science kind of information in here because it's still relevant. No, thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Thanks for subscribing. Um, but yeah, I think next week I'm traveling, so I will not yeah, I don't think I'll be able to do a live next week. Yeah, I don't think so. But we will do one on that week afterwards. I'm still playing with either doing them on Sundays or Mondays. I think Sundays probably works better. Last time I think we did it on Monday. And so I think we'll do them on Sundays. We'll make them a thing on Sundays here. But thanks everyone for being here and staying. And yeah, we'll see you in the next one. Feel free to watch some videos on the channel, subscribe, do all that kind of stuff. Feel free to leave comments. I'm typically very good at responding, although I need to go respond right now. So have a good rest of your weekend, everyone. See you guys later.